My name is Aliyah, and I'm 25 years old. On a rainy afternoon after 3 years of silence, I returned to my ex-boyfriend's house with one single mission: to reclaim the final memento of a fallen comrade. But instead of my belongings, I was greeted by my suitcase being hurled into the mud. His mother stood on the high porch, sneering at me in front of her guests. "You're a gold digger who just won't quit. Get out of here before I call the police. My son is a CEO now. A low-level office worker like you has no business stepping foot in this mansion." I stood there in the pouring rain, not a single tear in my eyes, only a cold clarity. I reached into my bag and pulled out a red, sealed folder from the Military Advocate General's office. I locked eyes with her and said, "You're right, your son is very successful. But there is one secret he hasn't shared with you yet. This entire plot of land where this mansion sits was left solely to me in an inheritance." The smug smile on her face froze instantly, turning into a mask of pure terror the moment she saw that red seal. I checked my military watch, my voice turning as sharp as a direct command. "You have exactly 24 hours to clear this pile of bricks off my land. After that, the excavators will begin the demolition process without exception." If this story resonates with you, like and subscribe to witness my ruthless cleanup in the next part. Leave your local time in the comments so I know you are standing with my justice. Now, let's begin the story. The Alabama sun in August is not a light, it is a weight. It was 3 o'clock, and the heat hung over the lawn like a wet blanket. The sun was a harsh judge, watching every move we made. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of hickory-smoked ribs and barbecue sauce that coated my throat. I slipped through the side gate, the red dirt still clinging to my worn shoes and cargo pants. I could still feel the phantom weight of the heavy pack on my shoulders. To the guests, I was a ghost. I had spent the last year in the dust of Kandahar, carrying scars that ran deeper than skin, but here I was just a shadow. All eyes were fixed on my sister Chelsea, who stood in a silk sundress that cost $3,000. She was holding a braided leather leash with a gold buckle, laughing as she showed off her new acquisition. At the end of that leash stood Titan. Titan was motionless, his black coat absorbing the sunlight like a void. Chelsea was beaming, telling the neighbors that she had spent $5,000 on his training, and that he was her reward for keeping the household running while I was away on my adventure. Chelsea smirked and told Karen that she deserved a little luxury after all she had done. He was worth every single penny just to see the envy on their faces. "Titan is better off with someone stable," she said, her voice ringing across the yard. She finally spotted me, but there was no relief, only a cold claim of territory. Someone who is always absent, like Aliyah, could never handle a creature this noble. I looked at my father, General Gregory. He didn't acknowledge my presence. He sat in his mahogany chair like a king on a hill, built on my blood and my sacrifices. He took a slow sip of his 20-year-old bourbon, the ice cubes clinking against the crystal glass with an indifferent sound. To him, my return was not a homecoming. It was a technical error in his afternoon. He saw the dust on my clothes and looked right through me, focusing on the smoke rising from the grill. I realized then that my chair at the table was gone. Chelsea had moved into my spot while I was bleeding in a dry creek bed half a world away. The injustice felt sharper than any shrapnel I had ever encountered in the field. I didn't yell. My time in the service had taught me that noise is for the weak. I could smell the sweat and the expensive perfume. Instead, I stood perfectly still, watching Chelsea's hand. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the leather strap, her fingers trembling. She was terrified of the animal she claimed to own. I noticed the details the guests missed. Titan wasn't wagging his tail. His ears were pinned back, and his eyes were fixed in a predatory stare. He was in a state of alert, his body vibrating with a tension that threatened to shatter the atmosphere of the party. I stepped forward, the dry grass crunching like breaking bone. Chelsea tried to pull the leash tight, her face twisting into a mask of fake authority. "Stay back, Aliyah. He's territorial now," she snapped. I could hear the expensive music playing, but it was just noise. But as I drew within 5 feet, the energy shifted. Titan let out a sound that silenced the music, a low, deep vibration that rattled the ribs in my chest. It wasn't a bark, it was a warning. His gaze locked onto mine, a deep recognition that bypassed the leather strap. The crowd went silent, the only sound being the hum of the air conditioners. I felt the heat of the stone under my feet. I leaned in, my voice quiet, but sharp enough to pierce the thick air. He does not belong to you, Chelsea. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving the smell of the bourbon and the hypocrisy behind me, walking into the hot Alabama evening. I left the silence of my father's house behind me. The sand in Kandahar is not like the white grains on a beach. It is like ground glass that gets into your skin and stays there. 6 months ago, I sat on a cot in a tent smelling of diesel. The only light came from a flashlight held between my teeth. My fingers were stained with grease from the patrol. I was staring at a paper, a voluntary allotment form. With a hand that did not shake, I signed away 80% of my monthly combat pay. I did not think about the heat or the mortars. I only thought about the deposit hitting my sister's bank account. I looked at a torn photo of Titan, my dog, and whispered that I would be home soon. That money was for my father's medication. It was for the specialized care Chelsea said he needed. It was for my ticket back to a life that mattered. I was bleeding for them, one paycheck at a time. Then the satellite phone rang. Chelsea's voice was thin and shaky. She told me the doctors were worried about Dad's pulse. She said the bills were piling up and the insurance was fighting every charge. "I'm doing my best, Aliyah," she sobbed. "But the house is falling apart, and Dad is so weak. Please, send whatever you can. Titan misses you." I felt a knot in my stomach. I told her I would take more night shifts. I would stay out on patrol longer for the extra pay. I hung up and sat in the dark, the desert wind screaming like a wounded animal. I did not know as I counted my last $5 for water, Chelsea was at a luxury car dealership in Mobile. She was putting a $20,000 down payment on a new SUV using my combat bonuses. She was buying silk dresses while I wore the same stiff uniform for 3 weeks. Now I am back here in Alabama, standing in the silence of my father's study. The room smells of stale tobacco and old money. The massive mahogany desk is polished to a mocking shine. I move toward the corner, away from the light spilling from the hallway where the guests were laughing. There was a cardboard box tucked under a stack of magazines. I pulled it out. The weight felt wrong. I opened the flaps and my breath caught. Inside the box were dozens of white envelopes. They were the letters I had sent from the front lines. Every single one was still sealed. The stamps I bought at the base were untouched. The red dirt from my hands was still on the paper. They had not read a single word. They did not care about my fear, my loneliness, or the nights I thought I would not make it. They only cared about the sacred 9-digit routing number at the bottom of my checks. I was a ghost to them long before I ever left. I reached deeper, my fingers brushing bank statements. My eyes locked onto a notice from the First National Bank. My savings account, the one I had built since I was 19, had been converted. It was a joint account. My sister's husband, Bradley, was listed as a co-owner. I stared at the signature. It looked like mine, but the slant was wrong. It was a forgery. He had been skimming $500 every week for his gambling debts. They had not just taken my money, they had stolen my future while I was defending theirs. The air grew cold. I did not cry. I had no more tears for people who saw me as a bank account with a pulse. I looked at the letters one last time, the words of a girl who loved a family that never existed. I reached out and gripped the rough edges of the box. I pulled the flaps together. The sound was sharp, dry, and violent, a hollow thud that echoed against the walls. It was the sound of a metal slide clicking into place. I was done being their sacrifice. The debt was settled, and now I was coming for every bit of the interest. The rain was coming down hard now, a relentless drumbeat against the tin roof that sounded like distant gunfire echoing through the valley. The Garcia living room was stale, smelling of mahogany polish and bitter, cold coffee. I took a sip from my mug, the liquid as dark and lifeless as the mood in the room. I reached into my bag and pulled out the First National Bank notice, placing it squarely on the mahogany coffee table. The paper looked out of place among the glossy magazines and the crystal coasters. Bradley didn't even flinch. He leaned back in the oversized leather chair, his legs crossed comfortably, a half smirk playing on his lips. "That's just a management fee, Aliyah," he said, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension you'd use on a child who didn't understand how the world worked. "You were gone for 12 months. You think this estate stays standing on its own? Someone had to manage the accounts. Someone had to make sure the lights stayed on while you were off in the desert." Chelsea stood behind him, hands on his shoulders, watching me with rehearsed pity. "We had to make decisions, Aliyah. You weren't here. You can't expect us to just let everything fall apart because you're never around." I looked at my sister, but I didn't see family anymore. I saw a breach in the line. I saw a compromised system that had been feeding on my life while I was defending theirs. The anger that had been simmering for years didn't explode. It froze. It turned into a sharp, crystalline clarity that made every detail in the room stand out with agonizing precision. I saw the way her fingers gripped Bradley's shirt. I saw the way his eyes darted to the door. $500 a week, I said, my voice as flat as the Alabama horizon. That's a hell of a management fee for someone who doesn't own the account. Chelsea's voice rose into that sharp, moral tone she used to win every argument. "You went to war to protect this country, didn't you? Is this how you treat your own blood? You're going to be petty about a few dollars after everything we've done to keep this family together? You're selfish, Aliyah. You've always been selfish." The door to the study opened and the room went cold. My father, General Gregory, walked in. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the bank notice. He kept his eyes on the wall, where his old uniform hung in a glass case like a ghost watching over the living. He walked with the heavy, measured gait of a man used to being obeyed without question. He stood at the head of the table, the shadow of his stature falling over the forged documents. "I am the commander of this house," he said, his voice a low growl that demanded submission. He finally looked at me, but there was no love in his eyes, only the cold calculation of a man facing a mutiny. "You're making a scene, Aliyah. You're being disruptive. If you continue to harass your sister and her husband over these trifles, I will have no choice. I still have friends at the Pentagon. I know your commanding officer. One report about your PTSD and your career is over. You want to be discharged in disgrace? I will do it to protect this family." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. He was weaponizing my service, using the very thing I had sacrificed my youth for to lock me in a cage of silence. I stood up slowly. I didn't shake. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain that Bradley was a thief and Chelsea was a liar. I picked up my briefcase, sliding the notice inside. I looked at the man who had raised me, the man who was willing to destroy my honor to hide his own failures. "In the field," I said, my voice a whisper that cut through the sound of the rain. "Silence is the first step when you're loading a round." I didn't wait for an answer. I walked out the front door, the heavy mahogany clicking shut behind me. The Alabama rain hit me, cold and honest. I walked to my car carrying the truth, leaving the storm to wash away their lies. The Alabama heat was thick, and the living room smelled of heavy bleach and aggressive cleaning supplies. Chelsea was moving through the space like she owned the air, throwing my old green notebooks onto the scarred oak table as if they were trash. Outside, the cicadas were buzzing so loud they sounded like a high-tension wire about to snap in the humid night. Chelsea didn't look at me. She looked at the version of me she had invented in her head. "You need to be realistic, Aliyah," she said, her voice sharp and brittle like dried glass. "This house needs a manager who actually lives in the real world, not some head case who still thinks she's hiding in a bunker with a rifle." I sat on the hard wooden chair and didn't look up at her. I watched a small crack in the table and counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3. Bradley was leaning against the doorframe, his fingers hooked around a cold beer. He laughed, a loose, hollow sound from a man who had never earned a single thing in his 30 years. Chelsea picked up my silver medal from the mantel, the one I had nearly died for in the dust. She held it up to the harsh yellow light of the ceiling fan. "How much do you think this is actually worth? Or is it just some fake junk they hand out to keep you quiet while you play soldier?" Before I could answer, she opened her hand and let it fall. The metal hit the stone floor with a dry, sharp crack that seemed to echo through the empty hallways. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the edges of my seat, but my face remained as flat and cold as a frozen lake. I stood up, leaned down, and picked it up in the heavy silence. I wiped the Alabama dust from the ribbon with my thumb and slid it into my pocket. They watched me, their eyes filled with a cruel satisfaction because they were certain they had finally broken my pride. "Fine," I said, my voice as steady as a dial tone. "What do you want from me?" Bradley stepped forward, holding a black folder and a pen. It was a management agreement, a legal document that would give them total control over every cent and every brick our father owned. They wanted me to sign away my rights, to admit I wasn't fit to handle the family estate. I took the pen. I didn't read the fine print. I just made a quick, jagged mark at the bottom of the page. It wasn't my signature, just a meaningless line they were too arrogant to even examine. I watched them trade a look of pure triumph. They truly believed the war was over. It was 10:15 in the evening when the house finally went quiet. I sat in the darkness of my room, the blue light from my laptop reflecting off my eyes. I opened a hidden file and began to type. At 10:15, Chelsea destroyed military property. At 10:30, Bradley admitted to illegal access of a private bank account. I wasn't a victim, I was a witness recording the facts. I began scrolling through Bradley's shared drive, my fingers moving across the keys with a rhythm they didn't know I had. That's when I found it, a hidden folder containing a secondary mortgage on my father's house. He had put the house up for a loan of $200,000 to fund a high-risk offshore investment that had already vanished. He wasn't just stealing my money, he was burning the roof over our father's head while laughing. I saved the file under a secret name and closed the screen. The room returned to a heavy, humid silence. I walked to the window and looked down at the porch. I could see Titan's silhouette in the moonlight, his heavy chain rattling softly against the wood as he shifted. He looked up at me, his eyes catching the light from the street. "Almost time, buddy," I whispered into the night. I wasn't retreating. I was just waiting for the fuse to burn down. The JAG office sat deep on the base where the Alabama humidity couldn't reach. Inside, the air was cold, smelling of toner and old legal files. A printer hummed, churning out pages of my stolen life. I sat across from Captain Miller, my posture perfect. He had gray eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from North Carolina granite. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with the same professional detachment I used when checking a weapons manifest for a long-range patrol. I sat straight, hands resting flat on my knees, waiting for the final verdict in silence. Miller slid bank statements across the desk. My eyes went straight to the columns. Every month in Mosul's heat, as the thermometer hit 122 degrees, a transfer happened. 80% of my combat pay, gone within 48 hours of hitting the account. I kept my breathing steady, though my heart was cold. Every single cent earned while dodging roadside bombs had filtered through a small mobile bank. "They took the entire pension fund, Aliyah," Miller said, his voice flat. "While you were out there clearing houses and risking your life, Bradley was using your signature to buy equipment for a project that doesn't exist. He didn't just take your money, he took your security." I looked at the numbers. They weren't just digits. They were days I survived, nights I hadn't slept, and blood I spilled for a country now watching me get robbed by my own blood. I didn't flinch. I needed facts, not a shoulder to cry on. "Why did you wait this long to bring this to us?" Miller asked, leaning forward. He wasn't judging. He was investigating a breach. I stayed silent, listening to the office hum. "Because I believed home was a safe zone, sir," I replied. My voice was low but steady. I made a critical error in identifying the target. I assumed the people I was protecting wouldn't be the ones pulling the trigger. I misidentified the threat, and I am here to correct that strategic failure. Miller reached for a heavy folder. A red stamp screamed, "Restricted" on the front. He placed it down on the desk like it was an unexploded device. "This is where it stops being a family dispute and becomes a federal matter," he said. I opened the folder. Inside were corporate papers from the Alabama Secretary of State's office. Bradley had set up a complex shell company using my identity. He had been using it to launder funds from illegal construction sites in Mobile and Biloxi, hiding the trail under my active federal security clearance. This was a federal felony. If authorities came knocking, I was the one who would wear handcuffs while Bradley enjoyed his beach house. The betrayal was a physical weight, but I pushed it aside to focus on the mission. It was a cold, calculated betrayal by the people I had once loved. I turned the pages, seeing my name scrawled on documents I had never seen, in places I had never been. My own sister had helped him. She had sat at that dinner table, smiling and passing the barbecue ribs, while she helped her husband turn my career into a criminal enterprise. I closed the folder. The sound was a sharp, hollow thud that echoed in the office. It was the sound of a heavy metal slide clicking into place. Miller watched me carefully. "You know what happens if we move forward with this, Aliyah? Your father is a retired general. This will tear his legacy apart. He will lose everything he spent 40 years building. Are you sure you want to pull this thread?" I stood up and smoothed out my uniform, feeling the familiar fabric against my skin. I looked him in the eye, my gaze unfaltering. I didn't look at the general's portrait on the wall. "My father had a choice, Captain," I said. He chose a fake reputation and a lying son-in-law over the truth of his own daughter. He chose the lie. I am ready to burn the house down to find the absolute truth. The garage was a tomb of rusted garden shears, old paint cans, and the lingering scent of motor oil. It was the only place in the Garcia estate where the air didn't feel like it was poisoned by lies. Outside, the Alabama night was heavy, the heat pressing against the walls, while the cicadas screamed in a rhythmic, high-pitched trance. I sat on a weathered wooden crate in the corner, far from the single light bulb that flickered overhead. I was cleaning the components of my service weapon. It was an old habit, a way to keep my hands busy and my mind sharp. The metal felt cold and honest against my skin, unlike the people inside the house. I could hear the muffled sounds of celebration leaking through the walls, the clink of expensive crystal, the heavy bass of a jazz record, and the loud, boisterous laughter of people who thought they had already won the war. Chelsea stepped into the garage, her midnight blue silk dress hissing against the oil-stained concrete floor. She smelled of $500 perfume and the sharp tang of gin. She looked at me with a mixture of disgust and triumph, her eyes scanning my dusty cargo pants. "Tomorrow is Dad's big night, Aliyah," she said, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "The fundraising gala is the most important social event of the year in Mobile. Every donor, every politician, and every retired officer will be there to toast the general's legacy. Don't you dare show up with that miserable funeral face and embarrass this family. If you can't pretend to be proud, at least stay out of the photos." I didn't look up. I just kept moving the brush over the steel, the sound a steady scrub in the quiet space. "I'll be there, Chelsea," I said. My voice was flat, a dead frequency that revealed nothing. She smiled, a cruel, satisfied curve of her lips, convinced that my lack of resistance meant I had finally been broken. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the lights and the music, leaving me in the shadows. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a short, encrypted string of text from Captain Miller. "The bridge is built. One signal from you and the trap snaps shut." I stared at the glowing screen for a second before deleting the message. Through the small, grime-streaked window of the garage, I saw Bradley. He was standing on the back porch, pacing back and forth, like a man who believed he had just inherited the earth. He was shouting into his cell phone, his voice carrying across the yard. He was talking about new capital and initial investments. He thought he was securing $200,000 by tomorrow morning, a loan he had taken out against a house that didn't belong to him. He was walking directly into the center of the minefield I had mapped out in the cold silence of the JAG office. He thought he was a player, but he was just a target. I stood up and set the clean metal parts aside. I reached for my boots. They were black, sturdy, and worn from miles of patrol in the desert. I began to polish them, the brush moving in long, deliberate strokes. I watched the leather transform, moving from a dull gray to a deep, mirror-like black. It was a meditation in discipline. Tomorrow, The elite of Alabama would gather in their tuxedos and gowns. They would drink 20-year-old bourbon and talk about honor while standing on a foundation of theft and betrayal. They would look at me and see a failure, a ghost of a soldier who couldn't fit into their perfect world. They had no idea that I was the one who had written the script for the evening. I looked at my reflection in the polished leather of my boots, my eyes cold and ready. The march was starting, and for the first time in 10 years, I knew exactly where I was going. The locker room at the base was quiet, the air thick with the smell of floor wax, and the faint metallic scent of gun oil. I stood before the narrow mirror, my hands moving with the mechanical precision of a technician. I adjusted my black tie, making sure the knot sat perfectly between the sharp points of my white collar. I buttoned my navy blue tunic, each heavy brass button clicking into place, like the locking mechanism of a high-security vault. On my left chest, the rows of ribbons sat in perfect lines, stars and stripes representing every night I had spent in the sand while my family was spending my paychecks. I did not look at my face. I looked at the uniform. I checked the leather briefcase sitting on the bench. Inside were the sealed documents from the legal office, the red ink of the restricted stamp practically burning through the paper. I was not going to a party. I was heading into a conflict where the weapons were legal briefs and forensic data. The ballroom in downtown Mobile was a sea of false smiles and expensive candles. The scent of vanilla and heavy perfume was thick enough to make my throat itch. Crystal glasses clinked, a sound like ice breaking under the weight of a heavy boot. I walked in, my heels striking the marble floor with a rhythmic, steady cadence that did not falter. I was wearing my dress blues, the fabric stiff and formal against my skin. I did not reach for a glass of champagne. I stood near a marble pillar, my gaze scanning the room. I located Bradley near the bar, laughing with a group of local developers, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who believed he had just pulled off a $200,000 theft. My father stood in the center of the room, surrounded by retired officers, his chest puffed out as if he were still leading a battalion instead of presiding over a house built on my stolen career. No one offered me a glass of water. To them, I was just a prop, a uniform to be shown off to prove the family's patriotic pride to the donors. Chelsea approached me, her midnight blue silk dress rustling like a snake in tall grass. She was holding a martini in one hand and a thin, decorative leather leash in the other. At the end of that leash was Titan. He looked miserable, his head low, eyes scanning the crowd for a way out of the noise. Chelsea leaned in, the smell of gin and entitlement rolling off her in waves. "Look at you, standing there like you were on guard duty," she whispered, a smirk playing on her lips. "Try to smile, Aliyah. Tonight is about the legacy of this family. Bradley is about to announce the new investment fund he created in your name. You should be grateful he is fixing the mess you left behind by being away for so long." I did not blink. I looked into her eyes and saw the greed hidden behind her expensive mascara. I did not say a single word. I just watched her until her smile faltered and she turned away, dragging Titan into the crowded room. I checked my watch. It was 8:15. Bradley stepped up onto the small wooden stage at the front of the hall, tapping the microphone for attention. The room went quiet, the elite of Alabama turning their faces toward him like flowers to a false sun. He started his speech, talking about vision, integrity, and the deep sacrifices made by military families. He was using my blood and my years of service as a sales pitch for a shell company that existed only to launder stolen money. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold glass of my phone. I sent a 3-word message to Captain Miller. Across the room, tucked into the shadows near the back entrance, Miller and 2 men in plain suits caught my eye. They did not move yet. They just waited for my final signal. Bradley laughed, his voice booming through the speakers. He pointed a finger at me, his face glowing with a fake warmth. "And here is my sister-in-law, our hero, who trusted us to protect her future while she protected ours. This project is for her." The hypocrisy was so thick I could taste it. I did not smile back. I gripped the handle of my briefcase and stepped forward, the floor silent under my feet. I gave Miller a single, sharp nod. The auditors began to move through the crowd, their eyes locked on Bradley. I walked toward the stage, my heart as cold as the brass on my tunic. The party was not over. It was just about to become a federal investigation. The stage in the grand ballroom felt like a sinking ship, though Bradley was too drunk on ego to notice. He stood there, holding a gold fountain pen over a ceremonial contract. The elite of Mobile sat in velvet chairs, watching the man they thought was a visionary. Bradley leaned into the microphone, his voice amplified and oily. "This investment fund is about the honor of a military family," he bragged, gesturing toward the giant screen. "It is about Aliyah's legacy." I didn't wait for him to finish. I stepped out from the shadows, my heels striking the floor with a hollow sound. I didn't need a microphone. My voice had been forged in desert winds, and it cut through the room like a cold front hitting the humid Alabama coast. "That contract is built on a stolen identity," I said. The room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the cooling system. Bradley froze instantly, the gold pen hovering like a dead insect. Behind him, the screen didn't show photos of our childhood home. Instead, the images flickered to scanned bank statements with rows of red numbers. The giant bright red letters of a federal investigation order appeared, glowing against the dark walls. Murmurs from the crowd rose like angry bees. Bradley's face turned from victory to a sickly gray. He looked for the respect he had spent 2 years buying with my money, but found only eyes filled with disgust. "What are you doing, Aliyah?" he stammered. "What is this trash on the screen?" I walked onto the stage, the light from the chandeliers reflecting off the brass buttons of my uniform. I didn't yell or scream. I just reached into my briefcase and pulled out the folder with the restricted stamp. I slid it across the podium until it hit his hand. "In the service, we call this a breach of the highest order," I said, looking him in the eye. "Out here, Bradley, they call it a federal felony. You didn't just take $200,000 from me. You took it from the federal government by laundering it through a military pension account. You didn't think I was watching. You thought I was a ghost." Far below the stage, a martini glass shattered. Chelsea had dropped her drink, the gin soaking into the expensive carpet. She stared at the screen, her mask finally falling off to reveal the panicked thief underneath. Then the side doors opened. Captain Miller walked in slowly, accompanied by 2 men in dark suits. They didn't ask for permission. They walked straight to the stage. "Bradley Garcia," Miller said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "You are being detained for financial fraud and the forgery of federal documents." The metallic sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the loudest noise I had heard in 10 years. It was a sharp, mechanical sound that signaled the end of the game. Bradley was led away, his silk tuxedo looking cheap under the lights. My father stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the ruins of the reputation he had worshipped. He looked at me, his hands trembling, his eyes searching for a lie he could still believe. Chelsea scrambled up the stairs, her silk dress rustling like dry leaves. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my sleeve. "You did this," she hissed, her voice a desperate sound. "You destroyed this house. You destroyed our family." I didn't pull away. I simply looked at her, and then at the man who had let her do it. I moved my arm, the movement final, dislodging her grip. "This family died a long time ago," I said to the ghost of the general. "I am just the officer here to sign the death certificate." I let out a sharp, low whistle. Across the room, Titan lunged, the thin leather leash Chelsea had used to mock him snapping like thread. He ignored her screams and ran to my side, his weight a solid, honest presence against my leg. I didn't look back. I walked toward the exit, the dog by my side, and the truth in my hands. The ballroom was a hollow shell, a silent battlefield where the only remains were the wreckage of a social hierarchy executed in public. The elite of Alabama had fled into the humid night, leaving a graveyard of overturned crystal, half-eaten shrimp, and the scent of spilled gin. Red and blue lights from police cruisers crawled across the walls, flickering through tall windows like a cold pulse. General Gregory sat alone in the front row of empty chairs. His shoulders were hunched, his spine curved like a bent wire. His tuxedo jacket seemed too large for his shaking frame. I stood 10 feet away, hands behind my back. I did not look at him with anger. I looked at him with the clinical distance of a doctor examining a terminal patient who had refused the cure. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of air conditioning and a distant siren. "You destroyed the name," he whispered, his voice a dry rattle. He didn't look up. The air smelled of 20-year-old bourbon, the scent of a man who started drinking before the handcuffs had clicked shut. 40 years of service, a legacy built on honor. And you tore it down in front of the entire city. I did everything for this family. I did everything to protect the Garcia name. He was playing the victim in a house he had set on fire himself. I took a single step. My leather heel hit the floor like a final punctuation mark in the vast room. I looked into his eyes, and for the first time, I did not see a general. I did not see a hero. I saw a terrified small man who had run out of lies. "You were never protecting a family, Dad," I said. My voice was as flat as a dial tone. "You were protecting a hierarchy. You didn't tolerate Bradley for Chelsea's happiness. You tolerated him because he bowed to you. He gave you the submission you demanded. And you hated my service because my integrity made you feel small. Every ribbon on my chest was a reminder that I was the officer you only pretended to be on television." Each word was a surgical cut. He looked at me, his fingers picking at the fabric of his trousers. "You are my daughter," he croaked, a desperate attempt to find a bridge that no longer existed. "You owe me your loyalty." I shook my head, my eyes never leaving his face. "Loyalty is a two-way radio, and you cut the wires years ago. You weaponized my career and forged my name while I was dodging bombs in the desert. You don't get to ask for loyalty when you are the one who opened the gates to the enemy." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver family crest, the metal cold against my palm. I placed it on the velvet seat next to him. It made a dull thud that echoed in the hall. "You asked what I want from you now," I said. "The truth is, I don't want anything. Not a penny, not an apology, and not a single word of explanation. I am done being the ghost you summon when you need to feel important." Gregory reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the silver crest. "Aliyah, wait. We can fix this. Just tell me what you need for a second chance. Tell me how to earn forgiveness." I turned on my heel, my movement final. I did not look back at the ruins of the man who raised me. "The worst punishment isn't a prison cell, Dad," I said, my voice trailing behind me. "It is the fact that for every minute of the rest of your life, you will live with the silence I am leaving behind. My permanent absence is the only thing you have left to call your own." I whistled a low note. Titan stood up from the shadows, his paws clicking on the marble as he fell into step beside me. We walked through the doors and into the honest heat of the Alabama night, leaving the dead past to bury its own. The engine of my old Ford truck was a low, steady rumble, the only thing filling the cabin as I drove through the endless Alabama cotton fields. It was 5:15 in the morning. The sky was a bruised purple, slowly bleeding into a deep, heavy orange on the horizon. I looked over at the passenger seat. Titan was there, his massive head resting on his paws, his breathing deep and even. He didn't need an explanation for why we were leaving, and for the first time in years, neither did I. I pulled into a rusted gas station on the edge of the county line. The air was cool and tasted of damp earth. I bought a cup of black coffee, the kind that was burnt and bitter enough to wake the dead. Back in the truck, I reached up and yanked off my black tie. I unbuttoned the top of my tunic, feeling the cool air hit my throat. It wasn't about being vulnerable. It was about realizing the job was done. The system had been cleaned. The fire I had started back at the gala was still burning behind me, but I was no longer the one holding the hose. My phone sat in the center console, vibrating like a trapped insect. Chelsea's name flashed across the screen a dozen times. She was leaving voice messages, her voice probably high and hysterical, begging me to help her deal with the lawyers or talk to the bank. Then came the texts from my father. They were short, pathetic attempts at an apology, draped in the same old language of duty and family reputation. I didn't open them. I didn't need to hear his version of the truth anymore. I reached down, held the power button until the screen went dark, and shoved the device into the back of the glove box. I closed the latch with a sharp click. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I was done being the translator for people who chose to be deaf. My responsibility to the Garcia name ended at the edge of this highway. I drove until I found a small, nameless lake hidden behind a stand of pine trees. I killed the engine and sat there for a long time, watching the water ripple in the early light. I traced the jagged white scar on my left forearm, a gift from a piece of shrapnel outside of Fallujah. I used to think that was my only wound, the only thing I had sacrificed. I was wrong. The real cost of my war wasn't a physical mark. It was the realization that the people who shared my blood were the same people who would happily watch me bleed out if it meant they got to keep their comfort. Losing them wasn't a tragedy. It was a tactical necessity. It was the price of admission for the rest of my life. I looked at Titan, and he nudged my hand with his cold nose, his tail thumping once against the seat. He knew I had finally come home, even if home wasn't a house anymore. I turned the key, and the Ford came back to life. I tapped the screen, setting the coordinates for a small town in the north, far away from the humidity and the mahogany cages of Mobile. I shifted into gear and pulled back onto the blacktop. In the rearview mirror, I watched the old world disappear into the morning mist. I didn't care what version of the story they told the neighbors or the officers at the base. I didn't care if they painted me as the villain or the broken soldier who lost her mind. Their words had no weight in this cabin. My only mission now was to find a place where the air was thin and the ground was solid. "We are going to be just fine," I whispered to the dog. The sun finally broke over the trees, a brilliant, blinding orange that washed over the dashboard. For the first time in 10 years, the noise in my head was gone. I wasn't waiting for the next hit. I wasn't watching the perimeter. I was just driving. And tonight, for the first time since I came home, I knew I was going to sleep a very deep, very long sleep.